Welcome, Michael Brooks Show live stream. I hope everybody's doing well in the several weeks into quarantine. Of course, smash the like button, hit subscribe, hit us with a super chat, do all of that. Check us out at patreon.com/TMBS if you can right now. I'm very happy to be introducing a first-time guest and somebody that a lot of people have been asking us to have on for quite some time. I'm happy we've put this together. Grace Blakeley, she's an economist and author of Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization. You could order it now. Grace, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
So Grace, there's a new leader of the Labour Party in the UK and some new leaks, if I understand, that are sort of reveal the scale to which the right wing of the Labour Party, the center left of the Labour Party, the everyone non-membership and non-Corbyn wing of the Labour Party really sought to undermine the Jeremy Corbyn project. Can you talk about that a little bit and where we are now with regards to Labour?
Yeah, of course. So what has come out, what's transpired over the last couple of days is a series of emails and WhatsApp conversations that have been compiled into a report that is being put together as a response to this investigation that's taking place in the Labour Party by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. So, we can go into that a little bit more later, perhaps. But effectively, there are all these allegations made against Corbyn that he was uniquely anti-Semitic himself, and also that the people around him were uniquely anti-Semitic. And I'm sure I know there is similar stuff that's happened in the US because, at least partly, issues of kind of genuine anti-Semitism have been often deliberately put together with, questions about the criticism of the Israeli state in a way that, allows the right to criticize the left on that more. So yeah, there was this, big furore. It was a constant feature of Corbyn's leadership, and this report is being compiled in the wake of Corbyn's leadership as the investigation continues. So the investigation is going on, and it's actually an investigation into the Labour Party as an institution, regardless of who is in control. And that's still continuing. So this is being submitted there. And the people compiling the reports came across all these emails and these WhatsApps. I think the first thing to clarify is that the Labour Party, as some of your listeners will know, some of them won't, the Labour Party is a kind of institution in the way that the Democratic Party isn't, as in it has constant members of staff that kind of run the Labour Party machine. And those are people who kind of coordinate that are political appointments. So those personnel tend to change when administrations change, but there tends to be a lag because sometimes they're elected, sometimes it's, difficult to get them out, whatever. So basically, after Corbyn was elected, there was this period where the people who were kind of staffing the machine were holdovers from the kind of previous era, and they hated Corbyn, hated, everything he stood for. Under Ian McNicol, who was then the General Secretary of the Labour Party. So that's the Labour Party as an institution. And what has transpired is that on WhatsApps that have been sent via their Labour Party email accounts and emails on their Labour Party email accounts, some of these staffers basically said some actively horrific things about Corbyn activists, including that they hoped that one activist who I myself and others know, I think, who has severe mental health problems, died in a fire. They referred to Carrie Murphy, who was one of a kind of a close figure in Jeremy's leadership and in the leaders of the opposition's office, as a cow, a bitch, perfect for you to be used for a dartboard. Some really, really horrific, sexist, horrible things. There's loads of really just personal, vicious stuff that is in there. But perhaps even more importantly, there's also evidence in there that these people, firstly, actively tried to undermine the Labour Party's chances of success in the 2017 general election because they wanted Corbyn out. And secondly, that McNicol, who was General Secretary, and the people around him had not investigated complaints of anti-Semitism made by elements of the party that they didn't consider legitimate, so by kind of left members of the party. And that had impeded the party's capacity to investigate those things. So it's really very, very significant. And I think, if this was being revealed outside of this insane context that we're living in, it would be receiving a lot more press attention. There were actually, incidentally, apparently a few papers that declined when offered to run this story. So it's in many ways, we're just lucky that it's come out at all.
Right. So where does that, and I mean, I think that's important, the idea that, like, on one hand, you can discover, I'm sure, and it's not a good thing or positive thing, but just, the idea of people kind of saying mean things or blowing off steam or whatever. I mean, you can make a case for privacy, but the bigger point of them actually sort of actively trying to undermine political victory, that takes something, at least in my read, and correct me if I'm wrong, that everybody knew, that there were wings of the party and the media and everybody that hated Corbyn, that hated that activist base, that wanted to bring the party back to the right. But there still was maybe some slight plausible deniability around them literally trying to lose in terms of their own. And so that is like groundbreaking in a sense. In terms
absolutely. I mean, that is undoubtedly the most important. Well, aside from the fact that they were obviously preventing the party from failing anti-Semitism, from tackling anti-Semitism better. That point about they're actually intervening in, attempting to intervene in various different processes to make it more difficult for Corbyn to be elected is undoubtedly the most important thing that's come out of this. It just completely shreds all of these guys, constant accusations that it was the left that puts kind of faction before party, that doesn't want to see right-wing leaders elected, whereas actually, the left is, has often frequently come out for and has had to come out for and campaigned for leaders that it doesn't support and agree with. Whereas when the right is faced with that outcome, this is what happens. I also think, though, that those kind of more personal things are potentially important as well, because because of the kind of cry bullying that there is on like the right and the liberal end of the Labour Party and of the centre left more broadly, because they will always come out and say, these guys are bullies, these people were mean to me on the internet, this is like the Bernie bros were mean to me on the internet, therefore I'm not going to vote for him thing, right? And yet it transpires as soon as you kind of peek below the veil that all of this is just completely and utterly made up. It's just like total emotional manipulation. And they can be just as mean and nasty as anyone else can be. So there is a lot in there that basically exposes a lot of these people as just complete and utter hypocrites and worse.
And so where are we now with the new leadership of the Labour Party?
Yeah, I mean, so, in many ways, this has come a little bit too late, because Keir Starmer, who is kind of, what we would refer to as the soft left of the party. So, you've got the left, you've got kind of the centre, and then you have the soft left. I suppose you could kind of think of it as socialists, like left liberals, and just kind of free market liberals. And Keir Starmer is kind of a left liberal, basically. He's not a kind of, we need to get rid of or seriously challenge the power relations that underpin capitalism. He's like, let's make the system work a little bit better. And I think that manifests itself in both his kind of policy agenda. So he will move away from, particularly areas that have pissed off capital, around public ownership, around worker control, all these different sorts of things, Green New Deal potentially, as well as his communication style, which, as we've seen over the last couple of days, is very conflictual. He kind of desires to create harmony in a lot of the ways that he's interacting with the press, with people with the government, with people on the other side of the aisle, and that at this point in time, he's obviously very risk averse, quite nervous, is saying he wants to bring everyone back together. But at this point, when, I don't know if your listeners will have seen, I mean, I know it's really bad in the US, but in the UK, things are getting really, really bad here with the coronavirus crisis. Frontline healthcare workers can't access personal protective equipment that they need to do their jobs. The number of people that are dying is really, really significant. And the government ministers simply aren't answering questions that are being posed to them. So Starmer's kind of non-conflictual style is kind of being exposed here as quite weak. And, that's just a short-term consideration. Over the longer term, we have this issue that those really quite significant policy ideas that were developed under Corbyn's leadership, aside from the phenomenon of Corbynism, which was about empowering the membership of the party, empowering the grassroots, bringing people back into politics. Aside from that kind of being pushed aside, we're also potentially going to see the removal of this really powerful anti-capitalist policy agenda that had begun to be developed under Corbyn. Some of it was just kind of like nice social democratic things, but some of it was more radical. And all of the more radical stuff, we're going to see the end of that at the time when we are facing this very, very extreme crisis in basically the foundations of capitalist accumulation. Workers can't go to work, people can't buy the things that capitalists are producing. We're facing a debt crisis all around the world. We really need at this point very, very radical policy solutions, and actually more than that, kind of understanding of how capitalism works and how it's inherently prone to these kinds of crises. And that is not something that we've got with Starmer, which is disappointing to say the least.
So can you talk, actually, let's go to the bigger picture. Let's talk about the thesis of your book, Stolen, which does actually, in some ways, one of the things I really like about the book, and this is a very easy talking point, but you hear it all the time, is, well, I mean, Marx may have been cool, but that was like during the mill era. And now we've got, credit cards and iPhones. So obviously primitive accumulation or all these other concepts, they don't count, man, because now we have technology. And that has always been one of the most annoying, mystifying talking points to me. And your book actually really traces basically how that framework that Marx developed in the context of mills, in the context of the enclosure of the commons, is being expanded and as capital, sort of goes into the air even more with financialization and tech and so on. So I guess, could you sort of put forward the argument of your book, and then, take us to what we're actually doing? I mean, we know the bailout in the United States, this is really basically the biggest consolidation of monopoly capital in the current era. We know that, the 2008 bailouts packages obviously had no accountability for Wall Street, and the stimulus was totally insufficient. But you actually had a 50-60% sort of Keynesian stimulus. We don't really have that now. There's maybe a bit more generosity in terms of kind of frontline delivery on things like unemployment, but the big picture is even more aggressive and regressive and consolidating than what we saw in 2008. So, and I know obviously there's different responses across Europe, and now we're going to, and later we'll also talk about more of the global South and how this fits into the broader global financial picture. But can you just talk about Stolen and how it fits with the primary government responses that we have so far?
Yeah. So I suppose I'll start by talking a little bit about what you mentioned initially, which was, is Marxism still relevant today, right?
Yeah.
And I suppose the best way to kind of think about this is to understand Marxism in opposition to like neoclassical economics, so standard mainstream economics, because that's really how he understood what he was doing. He's constantly kind of tearing apart Ricardo and Smith and all these people in Capital. And I think the three main things that come out of that from the perspective of my analysis are, firstly, that Marx analyzes production, whereas neoclassical economists analyze exchange. Secondly, that Marx focused on social class and neoclassical economists focus on individuals. And finally, that Marx has a view of capitalism that is based on a tendency towards crisis via the contradictions that are inherent within the system itself. Whereas for a neoclassical economist, capitalist economies tend towards equilibrium, so towards complete and utter stability. And I think, aside from the fact that Marx identifies a ton of different things in Capital that are directly relevant to the things that we're experiencing today, whether you're talking about kind of debt, whether you're talking about Keynesian demand crises, whatever, ecological crises, those lessons, the kind of opposition to classical political economy, to neoclassical economics, are really what we can draw out and use today. And that's really what I try and do in Stolen, is to say, okay, right, what is happening in the realm of production, not just in the realm of exchange? What is happening in terms of relationships between different classes, and particularly political, so power, political economic relationships between those classes, who has the power, and how is the system generating crises today? And on that analysis, I come to focus on the rise of finance because it's relevant in all of these different ways. So firstly, because production itself has become much more financialized. That isn't to say that, we're not producing stuff anymore. Obviously, we are producing tons of stuff. Just look around, commodities are everywhere. But actually, the processes of commodity production are increasingly subject to the logics of finance. So a lot of companies are either, very heavily indebted. So they are borrowing from banks or from financial markets, or they are sitting on big piles of cash that they're using to invest themselves. A lot of the time, rather than investing in production, like a firm, they will invest in financial markets, like an investment institution or like a financial institution. You have the financialization of production there that's really important. There's also something to think about in terms of the relationship between the different classes. Now, obviously, Marx primarily talks about the division between capital and labor, between workers and owners, but he also talks about divisions within capital. So there's capitalists, there's what he calls usurers, so kind of financiers, and landlords, and all these different sorts of classes. And he talks about how the surplus from capital accumulation is kind of divided between these different groups. And what we're seeing is actually, interestingly enough, increasingly not the kind of dominance of the bankers over the bosses. Because, you just have to look at like how important some of the world's biggest capitalists like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, whoever, how important those guys are to put to bed that idea. It's more that all these different kinds of capitalists are more focused on capital accumulation as a whole. So industrial capitalists are thinking more about finance as well as about production, and financial capitalists are thinking about production as well as about lending, etc. And this is partly because, for the latter, they are often, investing themselves or speculating themselves over what's going on in production through like financial markets. And for the former, it's because they're engaging in all sorts of strategies to maximize their profits, whether that's, taking on loads of debt or investing in financial instruments or hedging exchange rates or whatever, that you would usually consider to be the preserved kind of financial institutions. So production, class politics, there's significant elements of financialization there. The other element of class, which is really important, and then we maybe talk about in a bit, is the way in which financialization and the extension of debt and asset ownership to a much wider section of the population has changed the dynamics of class identification amongst the proletariat, amongst working class people. So like people can access debt much more easily than they could before. They can buy houses. Well, they could buy houses much more easily than they could before. And that has, on the one hand, kind of helped to gloss over a fall or a stagnation in wages. And on the other hand, given a lot of homeowners an incentive to support a capitalist system that actually exploits them. So on those two fronts, there's been a real change in class politics. And the final one, which is crisis. And I think, that's really the most obvious thing, because the book really centers around the financial crisis of 2008. And it looks at how that crisis wasn't just the kind of a banking crisis that resulted from a couple of bad apples at the very top, or even, the failure of regulators. Those things are all important. But this was actually something that was built into the structure of the entire system that had been developed, really of the entire capitalist system, but particularly the type of capitalist system that had emerged from the 1980s, where businesses were much more financialized, much more indebted. Households were speculating over house prices, taking out debt themselves, all these different sorts of things. And so that tendency towards crisis, that crisis of 2008 was inevitable. It wasn't just, accidental. It wasn't just contingent. And then the book looks a bit about the crisis tendencies that have emerged in the wake of the financial crisis. So the emergence of this idea of secular stagnation, which is stagnant productivity, stagnant wages, where that's coming from, and looks at the kind of seeds of the next crisis. And for me, that was again centered on this question of debt, which today we have this global debt mountain 3 times the size of global GDP. Some of that is public debt, some of it's sovereign debt, a lot of it is private debt, and particularly corporate debt, which has become a really, really big thing after a decade of low interest rates, a decade of, central banks trying to channel money into the private sector. So even before this crisis hit, I was writing last year about the next financial crisis, which was going to be, I thought, in part, driven by this unsustainable increase in corporate debt. And now what we're seeing, now that we've had a kind of, in many ways, external crisis hit the system, although obviously it's, the nature of that crisis has been determined in part by the system itself. It's not completely external, but is in part. And now what we're seeing is this corporate debt problem becoming really, really significant, because if businesses start collapsing because they can't pay their debts, because they're not earning any income, then suddenly the entire financial system starts to look precarious, because the banks and these institutions are worrying. The same can be said of states that have borrowed on international financial markets and can't pay that back. The same can be said of households who are borrowing, who borrowed and can't pay their mortgage or whatever. And yeah, that's kind of the big crisis that is happening within the crisis that we're seeing right now. Is this problem of debt.
So can we actually, I want to get back to just canceling debt generally in a second. Let's also connect that with the developing countries question. But when we talk about breaking up, having a little bit more of a refined understanding of different positions inside capital or different positions inside the workforce, this is something you've written about recently, and I think it's both important to the immediacy of the situation we're in, regardless of what everybody's sort of long-term vision or policy sets might be, and also I think something that is really politically important, and that is in the same way, in fact, that the capitalist class has been able to sort of maneuver a different position in relationship to workers because of giving them access to property, or some type of kind of broader stock ownership or moves like this. I think it's actually very important right now at a time when genuine small businesses, not as a Republican talking point. I don't know if it's valorized in the same way in the UK, but here, I mean, this goes back to Jefferson and landowner. I mean, this is a deep, deep romantic story in the United States. So, and it's bullshit. I mean, I have no doubt that a lot of the bailout, we'll pick through it, but it's going to be like, wait, why is Citibank getting this, small business bailout? Oh, well, they underwrite loans to small business, all the kind of basic corruption and dishonesty. That being said, one of the only terrains left in the US economy and internationally is some kind of, petite bourgeoisie, genuine small scale business, people who are mechanics who own their own shop, bodega owners, the greengrocer. To the extent those things exist, it is an actual site of at least resistance to monopolization in the economy. Of course, these bailouts do not do much for people in those positions at all. And even inside the United States, small business is defined, I think, the bailout is like 500 employees. So that's already generating like an enormous range of what we're actually talking about. But do you think, from a socialist perspective, that it's actually quite important right now to have a story for people, or a policy set, or an appeal for people in that position who might not identify with a desire for broader structural changes in the economy? They might think of themselves correctly as entrepreneurs or small business people or whatever, but they are victims of the consolidating and the monopoly tendency. And because of the nature of their scale, they will at least have the potential to have a different social relationship in their context, at least.
Yeah, there's a lot of points in there that I think that I agree with. So to begin with, the nature of the petit bourgeoisie, the small business owner, and the fact that could be part of the coalition is right often. There's the issue of there being people who are forced to create small businesses out of this idea of being falsely self-employed, right? So that can happen. But you also have genuine small businesses whose owners maybe don't earn that much money, but who are, necessarily, as a result of the fact that they own some of the means of production, defined as capitalists rather than workers. Often, sadly, those people have been the basis of social coalitions behind fascism. Which is, I think, the worrying thing, because, they see their living standards fall and often attribute that to external factors like immigrants coming in or whatever. But I don't think there's any reason why they couldn't become part of a more progressive coalition, particularly in this age of monopolization, right? And this is the key point here, I think, which is really why we should be concerned about small businesses. Is not necessarily that we want, small businesses to flourish and that will be the basis of a socialist economy, because that's obviously not true. The issue here is that during crises, there is this inherent tendency for the forces of creative destruction. So of, capitalist competition, meaning that some businesses die, some businesses grow, to accelerate. And that tends to mean that markets become more concentrated during moments of crisis, because small businesses can't compete, big businesses can. Small businesses can't draw on those huge pools of capital, those networks that link them to the state, to banks, that allow them to survive these crises, whereas big businesses can. Now, the issue with that is that you leave a crisis with a very, very monopolized system of capitalism. Now, that has a whole host of implications. Firstly, it makes capitalism work less well. So when there's less competition, outcomes are less efficient. It means that generally prices are higher, it means profits are higher, it often means wages are lower, and that creates a whole load of crises with which we should be very familiar. And you kind of get the Amazonification of the economy as well, which can be really, really problematic, especially given the state of most of Amazon's workers. But the other issue is that the tendency towards monopolization creates kind of cartelization of politics, where increasingly you have a tiny number of people who are the heads of the world's biggest corporations, the heads of the world's biggest banks, and the heads of the major governments, who you basically can fit in one room, right? And if you can fit them all in one room, they can coordinate, they can decide what they want to do, they can plan effectively economic activity, because they're, you would think capitalism can't be planned because it's based on competition. When you get rid of the competition, who is planning the capitalism? It's the people who are planning production, i.e. the managers and the shareholders of the big corporations. So you get this massive concentration of political and economic power. And that is important because it's much more kind of unassailable. It's much more difficult to attack when you have, the commanding heights of the economy controlled by this cartel, basically. Having said that, it also creates its own contradictions and problems. So monopolization, which leads to rising profits, potentially erodes the capacity of the working classes to be able to consume the things that capitalists are producing, which creates resistance from workers, as well as potentially harming profits. It also creates, obviously, general political backlash as, power becomes more concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And there's also a strong association between monopoly and imperialism, because generally those monopolistic corporations are headquartered in the global north, and they do their investment, i.e., building factories where they hire workers at very low wages and then suck all the profits back to the metropole abroad. So there's that tendency as well, which creates resistance in other places, in other parts of the world as well. So there is this general tendency, I think, at the moment that we're seeing towards basically state monopoly capitalism, right? Which is, a small cartel of business owners and politicians getting together and helping out one another and kind of planning the economic system. That tendency, which itself creates different potential tendencies. So on the one hand, it creates resistance, but on the other hand, it also creates potentially it kind of consolidates the system. And I think understanding that is really important for the left, because it's going to help us to think about how we are trying to organize and where we're trying to organize, both during this crisis and on the other side.
Absolutely. So let's take the imperialism thread and talk about how this is going to affect and is affecting the so-called developing world. And then we'll talk about the global bailout we need, because that's the title of this conversation. So we'll hit that at some point. So there's obviously very big differences in responses here. In Brazil, there's a whole political crisis around Bolsonaro basically rejecting that they're even in a crisis, and President Lula and others sort of counter programming. In South Africa, the ANC is actually getting a lot of credit for taking this extremely seriously and being proactive and delivering some resources to working people. But there's also been, and we see this even frankly in the United States, a lot of empowerment of some real policing brutality. So that's something to note. And then in India has gone from sort of we're a miracle. It's going to, it will pass us by to one of the most extreme lockdowns in the world. So there are these really, I just say this to note that there's obviously big geographic, economic, and ideological differences. However, there is the similar dynamic of what you were talking about before in terms of where wealth actually, how it gets accumulated, and then where it actually goes. And then the whole next idea of the consolidation of those dynamics around this crisis. So can you talk specifically about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I just wanted to pick up briefly on that point you made about South Africa, because I think it's been interesting to see how well many African countries, which really lack a lot of state capacity, have responded to this crisis. And that's at least partly because a lot of the new viruses viruses that have reemerged, medical crises that have emerged over the last several decades, have taken place in Africa and have killed a lot of people. And that has not become global news. It has not often been seen as important. Big pharmaceutical companies often haven't decided to develop drugs for those vaccines until it was, very, very late in the game. And I think that's at least partly why you've seen some sub-Saharan African countries respond to this really effectively, because they have experience, and they also know potentially that their healthcare systems are going to be put under a lot of strain if it is allowed to get to the situation that's happening in the US and the UK. I think the broader point is, as you mentioned, the relations of dependency that exist within the world system are structured by imperialism. So there's a bunch of poorer countries that are and will continue to be effectively dependent upon accumulation taking place in richer countries, even as they're told, if you just do X and Y and Z, you'll catch up with the rest of the world, right? So particularly, if you look at the very bottom of the global system in terms of wealth, is sub-Saharan Africa, formerly colonized by Europe and only released from that in the 1960s, unlike Latin America, which of course colonized earlier and released earlier, and which is at the very bottom of the global value chain in terms of production. So basically, raw materials, basic commodities that it produces and then exports, and that's how it develops some income. And there's this myth that sub-Saharan Africa will develop in exactly the same way as Britain developed, as the first capitalist country. First, it produced, food, and then it went on to produce manufactured goods, and then it went on to produce services. This is the kind of modernization theory myth. Of course, Britain did that at a time when the rest of the world had not really, discovered, as it were, capitalism, where capitalism hadn't been enforced upon the rest of the world. And of course, imperialism is what partly did that job. Whereas today, if you're a sub-Saharan African country exporting commodities, in fact, if you are any core commodity exporting country, you will find that there are a host of structural impediments that prevent you from industrializing. So firstly, there's like the terms of trade. There's the fact that often the things that you're selling aren't going to allow you to buy the things that you need, the capital goods that you need in order to industrialize. There are all the shocks associated with movements in exchange rates, which often create crises in these economies. There is the fact that as a government, if you want to try and do some of the spending, you have to borrow from investors, largely in the global north, who will often charge you quite high interest rates and then leave as soon as there's any sign of trouble, which we'll come back to later. There's the fact that the intellectual property that would allow some of these countries to develop is all owned and monopolized by companies in the global north. And there's the fact that actually even, the basis of investment that does exist in these economies, the capital that is accumulated there, is basically stashed in tax havens, owned and controlled by Wall Street or the City of London, and therefore can't be used for domestic development. So there are all these traps that are preventing these countries from industrializing. And that is to do with, as I said, the kind of relations of imperialism that exists within the global economy, the fact that the states to kind of industrialize initially retain a position of power in the global economy relative to those that haven't. And that's obviously at the moment, the global hegemon is the US, where you have most of the world's largest corporations headquartered, where a huge amount of intellectual property exists, where, you have the dollar being the center of the international system, as in you find many of these other countries, they have to borrow in dollars if they want to be able to, get access to investment. So yeah, these relationships of imperialism have prevented these countries from developing for a very, very long time. The exceptions, of course, have been those countries that have gone around the rules imposed on them by the US and others. So China, Southeast Asia, where the state played a very, very active role in pushing towards a different kind of economic model. So, those countries that have been able to kind of escape that trap are those that have ignored all the rules that the IMF and others impose upon the developing world and say, open up your economy, privatize everything, cut public spending, etc. But the dynamics that we're really seeing emerge today, the crisis that is happening for the global south again today, is another debt crisis. And the dynamics of this are similar to those that took place in the 1970s. So in the kind of post-war period, you had capital flowing into the global south because, it was often, partly that was state aid, partly that was investors thinking that they'd be able to earn a high return in those places. And interest rates were not low by today's standards, but relatively low. So investors were kind of pushed into those higher return economies. When interest rates went up really high in the 1980s, that capital flooded back into the global north. And of course, a lot of that capital was being used for investment in infrastructure, in all these sorts of things that couldn't just be sold so that the debt could be repaid. And you had the emergence of these debt crises. Today, what we've seen is that over the last 10 years, interest rates have been very, very low in the global north. And there's broadly been this phenomenon of investors kind of reaching for yield, which basically means they can't find the returns that they need. So they're going out in search of all different sorts of risky things that they can do in order to generate the returns that they want. And one of those things has been lending to governments in the global south, also just investing in various different projects in the global south. The issue is that, so we haven't seen obviously a big hike in interest rates, but what we have seen is this big crisis. And when investors get scared because there's a crisis, they pile into the dollar. So generally, in a crisis, it's very difficult to imagine that the crisis is going to end when the prices of assets are going to stop falling, when you're going to be able to access credit again. So as a result, investors tend to sell everything and just pile into things they consider safe. Sometimes that's gold, sometimes it's just domestic currency, but a lot of the time it's the dollar, because the dollar is the safest, really, asset because it is backed up by the world's largest imperial power, which can enforce its will. So you get an outflow of capital from the global south and into particularly the US, which means that governments are finding it very, very difficult to access the capital that they need to maintain their debt repayments, basically. This means interest rates go up because there's, the supply and demand is out of sync. There's more bonds available because investors don't want them, but there's less demand because investors all want dollars, which pushes interest rates up, which makes debt servicing more expensive. That means that in a crisis where governments are having to spend more in order to provide basic health services for their citizens, those governments in the global south are having to spend more repaying debts to private creditors often than they are on public health. And there's some really interesting research that's come out today from the Jubilee Debt Campaign, which is at Drop the Debt on Twitter, that's shown that there are a bunch of countries, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, that are spending more on debt repayments to private investors than they are public health in their own economies, which is absolutely just completely unacceptable. And we've already seen Argentina is heading towards another default. There are potentially a bunch of other economies that are going down the same route. And unless there is some sort of write down, so unless the people who've lent to these countries are forced to take a hit, there's a humanitarian catastrophe in these places. So, I think at the moment this is one of the things that's being largely ignored, but it's really, really important to kind of put on the agenda. Is this mounting debt crisis that could A, yes, cause a humanitarian catastrophe, but B, also create really severe economic damage. You only have to think about the role that these countries play in global supply chains in terms of producing basic food to think about what an economic crisis in those countries would do to the rest of the world. So yeah, this is a big problem, and it's something that we should all be looking into and taking seriously.
So Grace, can you connect some threads for us? Like if you're designing a global bailout or a global plan, is the thread, amongst other things, go any direction you want to go in the last couple of minutes, obviously, but it's like, what element is there that connects that we need to wipe out debt that you just described in developing world? We need to wipe out medical debt in the United States. We need to significantly wipe out just consumer debt across the board. Is there a part of this that could really be simplified if we did have some type of consumer to international jubilee?
Yeah, I think, the principle for any global bailout or, domestic bailout or whatever that I would say is most central is that it should take power away from those who own all the stuff and give it to people who work for a living. So that principle of redistributing power from those who have too much to those who don't have enough is really, really central. And that means thinking about this not just in terms of wealth and income transfers, but yes, in terms of debt, in terms of employment, in terms of all these different things that shape whether or not we're able to, how we conceive of our own political situation as well as our economic situation. And that brings together a couple of different things. So firstly, there is the immediate problem of all this debt, right? So incomes everywhere are constrained because of what's going on. That means a lot of people, a lot of states, a lot of businesses can't pay their debt. When we're thinking about how to deal with that, again, bring back in this question of power. So states in the global south need to be able to provide basic health care for their citizens. Some of that debt needs to be written off. Like, they should not be prioritizing paying back powerful, wealthy investors over providing for some of the most marginalized people literally in the world. So that really should provide the basis for a plan. It's happened before, actually, in the early 2000s, a plan to significantly write down a lot of the debt that is owed to private investors by the countries in the global south. Then there is the question of private debt held by households in the global north. So that could be mortgage debt, could be credit card debt, whatever. And a lot of that, particularly unsecured debt, so debt not backed up by an asset like a house, is concentrated amongst some very, very poor households at very high interest rates. So a lot of people have debt that they basically can't pay back because they're not earning enough to pay back the interest, let alone the amount that they originally borrowed. And there has been a strong case for a very long time to, again, write a lot of that off. Some of it just cannot be paid back. Like, people are not earning enough to literally feed themselves and repay their debts. It needs to be written off. For other people, the pausing of mortgage payments, that's good. That's going to help. I don't think that should be written off because you're giving people, a small number of people, free houses if you were just to write all the mortgage debt off. But pausing it seems like a good idea if it's combined with measures to make sure that tenants are also not being forced to pay out at the same time. Then I think there is this question of corporate debt, which is probably the biggest one because that's the one that the governments are most worried about, and it's where most of the money is going in terms of the bailouts at the moment. And what you're seeing is two different strategies. So firstly, providing liquidity, which is basically short-term loans to businesses to let them get through the crisis. And the second thing, which we haven't seen much of yet, but we'll probably start seeing in the future, is nationalizing these companies. So providing actual bailouts where the state buys a chunk of the company in order to stop it going under. This is what happened in the UK in the financial crisis. There was an initial question as to whether or not the banks were illiquid, so they couldn't access cash, or insolvent, so bankrupt. Eventually, after trying to provide them with loads and loads of loans, the central banks around the world realized that these banks were not just illiquid, i.e. they didn't just need more cash, they were insolvent, i.e. they were bankrupt. When that was realized, the state was like, right, we're going to have to buy up these banks and bail them out. And I think we will start seeing pressure for big corporate bailouts. And when that happens, I think firstly, it's very important to make sure that small businesses, as I said, are getting access to the credit that they need to be able to survive this, and potentially grants as well as just loans, because they've already got quite a lot of debt anyway. When it comes to bailouts, you are going to see pressure for very, very big companies to get corporate bailouts. And if that is not accompanied by conditions, then it's just going to be like the financial crisis all over again, where a tiny elite basically gets saved from the consequences of their own actions and everyone else pays the price. So I think we really need to be demanding that any bailout that does take place is done for the public good, rather than just basically saving the interests of capitalists. And that means things like, making sure that these firms keep on workers, making sure they're not paying out huge dividends to shareholders, making sure that they are adopting high environmental standards, all of these sorts of things. And actually, those companies which are owned by the state can then provide the basis for the post-crisis recovery, because the state can start channeling funds through these businesses, getting them to employ people again, getting them to invest, which can help to kickstart the economy on the other side and be actually part of a Green New Deal, which we're going to need after this is done to rebuild the economy when the actual crisis is over.
Grace Blakeley, awesome. I really, really appreciate your time. Everybody check out Grace's work. We'll have links. Hopefully we'll do this again. Thanks a lot, Grace.
Thanks for having me.
Stay safe.
You too.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.